A United States Marine is standing in the open. His arm is raised. In front of him, a wounded Japanese soldier is emerging from a cave. The Marine is not behind cover. He is not aiming. He does not know what the man coming out of the cave is holding. In this war, that distinction matters. A raised hand could mean surrender. It could mean a grenade tucked against a palm. It could mean a man with a satchel charge under his jacket, or a grenade in his fist, or nothing at all, and the only way to know was to wait. By the summer of 1945, every Marine in the Pacific had learned not from a manual, not from an order, that a Japanese soldier emerging from cover was not automatically a man giving up. He was a question with no safe answer. And yet this Marine is standing in the open arm, raised his finger off the trigger, choosing to find out. That photograph was taken on July 25, 1945, on Okinawa, 12 days before Hiroshima. The island had been declared secure 33 days earlier. That meant organized resistance had ended. It did not mean the caves were empty. The limestone karst of southern Okinawa still held men who had not come out, some wounded, some waiting, and from outside, a cave mouth, you cannot tell which. The photograph is in the National Archives. Attached to the file is an official caption. It notes without comment that earlier in the war, Japanese soldiers who surrendered amounted to roughly 1% of total enemy killed or captured. On Okinawa, that number had reached approximately 11%, more than 10 times higher. The caption treats this as a data point. It is not. It is the record of something that had to be built one island at a time at a price the caption does not name. To understand why that Marine is standing in the open, what it took for one man to stand there, arm raised, in a war where the gesture had gotten people killed, you need to go back 3 years. To a beach on Guadalcanal, to a night in August 1942 when 25 men climbed into a boat because they believed in the rules of war. Most of them did not come back. What does it cost to stand there? That is the question. 3 years and 7 months before that photograph was taken, a document was issued. Not the one this documentary is about. This one was real, and Imperial Japanese Army soldiers across the Pacific were widely issued a pocket-sized copy. January 8, 1941. War Minister Hideki Tojo signed the Senjinkun, the Imperial Army Field Service Code, and ordered it distributed across the force. It was a B6 booklet small enough to fit in a breast pocket. Soldiers recited it at morning and evening formation. Its language was not ambiguous. If alive, do not suffer the disgrace of becoming a prisoner. In death, do not leave behind a name soiled by misdeeds. That sentence is the architecture of everything that follows in this documentary. Not a suggestion, not a cultural tendency. A written order signed by the man who would become Japan's wartime prime minister, intended for distribution to soldiers fighting across the Pacific, the Philippines, China, and Southeast Asia. It did not say surrender was difficult. It said surrender was disgrace. The distinction matters. To understand what that meant in practice, you need to understand what Japan did next. In January 1942, the Japanese government sent a formal message to Switzerland, the neutral intermediary for the Geneva Conventions, promising that Japan would observe the 1929 Geneva Convention on the treatment of prisoners of war, mutatis mutandis. That phrase means with the appropriate modifications. Japan had signed the 1929 Geneva Convention, but never ratified it. The 1942 message was not a reaffirmation of a binding obligation. It was a voluntary commitment made under international pressure, and it was also a fiction. Because 2 years before that promise in 1940, the Japanese Army had quietly amended its own field service regulations. The provision about wounded soldiers, the one that in any army that observed the laws of war required that the wounded be protected and treated, had been replaced. The regulations made clear that wounded soldiers were not to fall into enemy hands, and the means to prevent it were distributed accordingly. Then, in 1942, The Army Criminal Code was amended. Again, any officer whose men surrendered faced 6 months imprisonment. Western accounts often reach for Bushido to explain what happened next. The warrior ethos, the ancient samurai tradition, the cultural imperative. The framing is not entirely wrong, but it is incomplete. Bushido, as a formal code, was largely a Meiji-era construction, given its most influential Western formulation in 1900 by Inazo Nitobe, who wanted to give Japan's military culture a European philosophical equivalent. It was real as ideology. But what governed Japanese soldiers in 1941 was not ideology alone. It was a pocket-sized booklet signed by Hideki Tojo, backed by a criminal code enforced by officers who faced prison if their men surrendered. The mechanism was institutional. The coercion was concrete. The ideology gave the institution cover. That is the world into which the United States Navy's hospital corpsmen were sent. A Navy corpsman was a sailor, not an infantry marine, but he served alongside Marines because the Corps had no organic medical service of its own. The Navy provided the doctors and medics. By the rules of war that both the United States and Japan had agreed to honor, he was a protected person. He wore a Red Cross brassard on his arm, the international symbol of medical neutrality codified in the Geneva Conventions since 1864. He carried no offensive weapon. When a Marine was hit, he called for his corpsman. The corpsman ran toward the sound. The laws of war said the man with the Red Cross on his arm was off limits, a protected person in a category that even enemies who disagreed about everything else had agreed since the 19th century to leave alone. The Senjinkun had already determined what the Japanese Army thought of categories it had not created. By the time the first Marines landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, the Japanese soldiers they faced had been widely issued that pocket-sized booklet recited at formation, carried in the breast pocket, its prohibitions absorbed as doctrine. The rules of war said a wounded soldier was supposed to surrender if he could not fight. The Senjinkun said something different. The criminal code said something different. The commanding officer who faced prison if the wrong number of men gave up said something different. The collision between those two systems was not a philosophical debate. It was 25 men in a Higgins boat in the dark on a beach near the Matanikau River. The rules of war said a wounded man was a protected person. On the night of August 12, 1942, at approximately 1800, Lieutenant Colonel Frank Goettge stepped into a Higgins boat with 24 other men and went to act on that belief. Goettge was the 1st Marine Division's intelligence officer. He had received a report from a captured Japanese sailor. There were Japanese soldiers near the mouth of the Matanikau River on Guadalcanal, starving, demoralized, possibly ready to surrender. A white cloth had been spotted in the jungle. Goettge flew down from division headquarters to lead the patrol himself. He brought the regimental surgeon, Lieutenant Commander Malcolm Pratt. He brought Lieutenant Ralph Corey, a Japanese language specialist who had lived in Japan before the war and could speak to the men on the beach. 25 men total. The intelligence seemed reliable. The rules of war were in effect. The Geneva Convention had been formally invoked by the Japanese government 7 months earlier. They landed in total darkness on a narrow strip of beach near the Matanikau River mouth jungle. On one side, the ocean on the other, no line of retreat. Goettge was killed by the first burst of gunfire. Of the 25 men who landed on that beach, 3 made it back. Sergeant Charles Arndt swam approximately 5 miles to safety. Corporal Joseph Spaulding followed. The last man out was Sergeant Frank Lowell Few. He was 22 years old from Buckeye, Arizona. He had been bayoneted through both hands and his right arm during the fighting. He killed 1 Japanese soldier with his own bayonet, clubbed a second with a rifle that had stopped working, borrowed Arndt's pistol, and shot a third. Then he entered the water and swam 4.5 miles back to the marine perimeter at Kukum. From the water, he watched what was happening on the beach. Few told the correspondent Richard Tregaskis what he saw. Tregaskis wrote it down in 1943. The Japs closed in and hacked up our people. I could see swords flashing in the sun. The white cloth on that beach may have been a Japanese naval ensign with the red sun disk folded back, the identifying mark hidden so it looked like a flag of surrender. If it was used deliberately to lure the patrol, it was perfidy. A war crime under the Hague Conventions of 1907, codified international law that predated the Geneva Convention itself. The record does not establish intent beyond doubt. What the record establishes is what Frank Few saw from the water, and what 25 men on a beach taught a division in a single night. No order followed. The division knew before dawn. Major General Alexander Vandegrift wrote to Marine Corps Commandant General Thomas Holcomb afterward. He described what his men had encountered and what it meant. "I have never heard or read of this kind of fighting," he wrote. "These people refuse to surrender. The wounded will wait until men come up to examine them and blow themselves and the other fellow to pieces with a hand grenade." Then he wrote the sentence that required no elaboration. You can readily see the answer to this. He did not write the answer. He didn't have to. The answer had already been given on the Matanikau River beach, and it spread without his signature. 8 days later, August 20th, 1942, beginning at approximately 1:30, Major General Kiyonao Ichiki led approximately 916 men of the 28th Infantry Regiment into Marine machine gun positions at Alligator Creek, a sandbar where the creek met the sea. The sandbar was 150 to 200 feet wide, flanked by ocean to the south and river to the north. There was nowhere to retreat and nowhere to flank. 41 Marines were killed, 71 wounded. Approximately 800 Japanese soldiers died on that sandbar or in the water trying to cross it. 15 were captured. During the aftermath, a wounded Japanese officer, possibly Ichiki himself, the record is uncertain, feigned death as Marines moved through the bodies. When a Marine leaned down to examine him, the officer fired a pistol and seriously wounded the Marine. A private named Andy Polini intervened. What emerged after that was not policy, but reflex, the only response the war had by then made available. Marines shot any Japanese soldier who moved. Not an order, a lesson. The distinction matters because an order can be countermanded, reviewed, rescinded by a general with a pen. A lesson learned in blood on a narrow sandbar in the dark cannot. It spreads. It becomes the new baseline. Every Marine who arrived on Guadalcanal after August 21st arrived into a unit that already knew what the unit before it had learned. Ichiki died whether by seppuku or in a final advance toward American lines, the record disagrees. His diary entry for August 22nd was never written. The Red Cross brassards that Navy corpsmen wore, the international symbol that was supposed to mark them as off-limits, were now operating in a theater where the symbol's guarantee had been tested and found unreliable. The corpsmen had not yet been targeted directly. That would come. But the first lesson of the Pacific War had been written on a beach near the Matanikau River by 22 men who did not come back from a boat they believed was going to a surrender. Everything that followed ran forward from that night. What happened on the Matanikau River beach needed no orders to travel. It moved the way all battlefield knowledge moves through the men who survived long enough to teach it. By November 1943, that knowledge had crossed the Pacific from Guadalcanal to a coral atoll called Betio in the Tarawa chain of the Gilbert Islands. The garrison there was approximately 4,500 men under Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, who had surveyed the island's fortifications, more than 500 reinforced pillboxes and gun positions surrounded by a reef, and made a statement that was recorded in the after-action histories. "It would take 1 million men 100 years to conquer Tarawa," he said. It took the 2nd Marine Division 76 hours. November 20th to the 23rd, 1943. 1,009 Marines were killed. 30 Navy sailors died alongside them. 2,292 were wounded. Those are the American numbers. Here is the Japanese number, 17. 17 Japanese military personnel surrendered at Tarawa, out of approximately 4,500. Most of those 17 were unconscious or physically incapacitated when they were found. The number who made a fully deliberate conscious choice to walk out with their hands raised was, by historian analysis, close to zero. 129 Korean laborers were also captured, conscripted construction workers, not combat personnel. They do not count in the 17. 17. You can picture 17 men. You can fit 17 people in a large room. The reef surrounding Baitio extended 800 to 1,200 meters from the shoreline. Landing craft grounded on the coral in chest-deep water hundreds of meters short of the beach. The men who survived that crossing were now in November 1943 operating under the same protocol that Private Andy Polini and Frank Few and the survivors of the Matanakaw Beach had established 14 months earlier. The Shoot the Dead Protocol, the No Approach Protocol, the understanding that a man lying still might be waiting. The cycle had a name now, even if no document had given it one. Eugene Sledge, a Marine rifleman who fought at Peleliu and Okinawa and later wrote about it without euphemism, named it plainly, "We never took prisoners. Even when some few tried to give up, they often tried to throw a grenade at us. After taking a position, we routinely shot both the dead and wounded enemy troops in the head to make sure they were dead." Peleliu, September 15th to November 27th, 1944. 73 days. The Japanese garrison numbered approximately 11,000 men under Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, dug into Umerbrogol Mountain, 500 interconnected caves and tunnels cut through jagged coral ridges. The ground temperature on the coral surface reached 46 degrees Celsius. U.S. casualties approximately 1,800, killed 8,000 wounded. A 40% casualty rate among the Marines who landed. Japanese captured 202 total. Of those, 19 were Japanese combatants. 183 were Korean and Okinawan laborers who had been conscripted to build the fortifications. 19 out of 11,000. Sledge watched what the other 10,981 chose and what it produced in the men around him. He called it a brutish, primitive hatred. He did not use that phrase to excuse what the Marines did. He used it to name what the cycle had made of both sides. The tunnels beneath Umerbrogol created a problem that had no tactical solution. Japanese positions captured in the morning were reoccupied from below by afternoon. The dead could not be relied upon to stay dead. A position you had cleared was a position you might need to clear again. The rational military response established at Guadalcanal, confirmed at Tarawa, institutionalized at Peleliu, was to make certain. The United States government saw what was happening. On June 13, 1944, a Judge Advocate General's memo noted that the mutilation of enemy dead was repugnant and warned that such acts could result in the death penalty under existing law. No documented prosecutions followed. What followed instead was a different kind of institutional acknowledgement. U.S. military commanders trying to generate intelligence from live prisoners began offering incentives for Japanese soldiers brought in alive. The going rate documented in internal memos a case of beer or a bottle of whiskey per Japanese prisoner captured. Later, the offer was raised to 3 days' leave and ice cream. That is the measure of how entrenched the cycle had become. The United States government didn't order it. It could not stop it. It could only try to introduce a competing incentive, and the incentive it chose was alcohol and dairy products. The men with the Red Cross brassards, the Corpsmen, were now operating in every one of these campaigns. They had adapted. The brassard in some units had come off. The sidearms in some units had gone on. A man marked as a protected person was learning that the mark was not protection. The cycle was not yet finished with them. On Iwo Jima, the word that was supposed to guarantee safety became a sound that could not be trusted. The word a wounded Marine called out when he needed the man with the medical kit and the red cross on his arm, the word that in any other war meant safety was coming. Corpsman. Marines who served on Iwo Jima later described hearing that word called out from Japanese tunnel entrances in English at the right moment when a Marine was down and the position was confused. Whether this was deliberate tactical coordination or isolated incidents that spread through Marine accounts is difficult to establish precisely. No Japanese operational directive ordering the practice has been found. What the Corpsman and Marines documented was the effect the word that summoned a specific category of person, unarmed marked running, had become unreliable as a signal of genuine need. The adaptation, if it was systematic, followed the same mechanism that had spread the shoot-the-dead protocol from Guadalcanal to Tarawa without a memo. The Corpsman adapted in return. Pharmacist's mate Second Class Stanley Dabrowski described it in an official U.S. Navy account. "We carried medical kits, which I didn't like at all, because they marked us as corpsmen. Because of this, we were told to carry sidearms, not as offensive weapons, but for self-protection." The Red Cross brassard, the symbol that had been codified as international law for 80 years since the first Geneva Convention in 1864, came off. The sidearms went on. The corpsman of Iwo Jima went into combat with the same designation as every other man in the assault a target. D-Day, February 19, 1945, 0900. The 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions landed on the black volcanic ash beaches of Iwo Jima against a garrison of more than 20,000 Japanese under General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, who had spent months engineering what he called a war of attrition. The beach was a 15-foot terrace of volcanic ash that the landing craft could not climb. The ash was geothermally warm underfoot. The island sits on a volcanic vent, and the ground itself radiated heat. Men sank into it. Equipment sank into it. The first wave could not move inland because the terrace held them at the waterline, exposed while the garrison watched from prepared positions above. Beneath the rock, Kuribayashi's men had built 11 miles of tunnels, 1,500 rooms, interconnected passages that honeycombed every surface position from below. A Marine who took ground at 0900 might find at 1400 that it had refilled from underneath. The corpsman who landed on that beach that morning faced not only fire terrain and tunnels, but also a battlefield in which even the call that was supposed to bring them forward could no longer be fully trusted. 332 corpsmen were killed or died of wounds on Iwo Jima. 659 were wounded. In some battalions, the corpsman casualty rate exceeded 50%. In one battalion, 68% of corpsmen were killed or wounded. 4 Navy corpsmen received the Medal of Honor at Iwo Jima out of 27 Medals of Honor awarded for the entire battle. More Medals of Honor given to corpsmen in a single engagement than in any other battle in the Second World War. The citations tell you what that means. The day after D-Day, February 20th D, +1 Private First Class, Jacqueline Lucas threw himself onto 2 Japanese grenades simultaneously to protect the Marines around him. He was 17 years old, an infantryman, not a corpsman. He had enlisted at 14 by falsifying his age, then stowed away on a troop transport to reach Iwo Jima. The grenades left 250 shrapnel fragments in his body. He survived. It took 26 surgeries. He became the youngest recipient of the Medal of Honor in the Second World War. On February 28th, 9 days later, the same island pharmacist's mate first class, John Harlan Willis, was treating a wounded Marine in a shell hole when Japanese grenades began landing around them. He picked up the first grenade and threw it back before it detonated. A second landed. He threw it back. A third, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, a seventh. The 8th grenade he threw back too. The 9th grenade exploded in his hand and killed him instantly. He was 23 years old. The Congressional Medal of Honor citation confirms that sequence. 8 grenades returned. Killed by the 9th. Each of those 8 was a choice, the same choice made again in the seconds available between the landing of a grenade and its detonation with a wounded Marine in the same shell hole, and the full knowledge of what the previous grenade had meant. Willis did not make that choice once and then act on reflex. He made it 8 times. The 9th time, there was no more time to make it. He was not an infantryman. He was a Navy hospital corpsman, a medical specialist serving with the Marines and in theory protected under the laws of war as non-combatant medical personnel. He was there because a Marine was wounded and could not move and called the one word that was supposed to bring help without risk. The OWI's own wartime analysis, examining why Japanese soldiers refused to surrender, reached a finding that the men at Iwo Jima would have recognized fear of being killed by Americans, the analysis concluded, may have been more important than fear of disgrace and a desire to die for Japan. Both things were true simultaneously on both sides of the same wire. The corpsmen had been told they were protected. The Japanese soldiers had been told they would be killed if they gave up. The laws of war had promised something to everyone on that island and honored those promises to almost no one. That same week on the same island, a Marine named Ralph Anthony Ignatowski, known to the men around him as Iggy, was captured alive by Japanese forces. What was done to him after capture was a documented war crime. Witnesses Cliff Langley and James Buchanan named what they found. The Geneva Convention that was supposed to protect Willis as a corpsman was also supposed to protect Ignatowski as a prisoner. Neither protection held in the same week on the same 8 square miles of volcanic rock. The documentary does not ask you to weigh those 2 facts against each other. They do not cancel out. They run in parallel, the cycle moving in both directions, simultaneously consuming everyone the laws of war had designated as protected. John Bradley Navy Corpsman, Navy Cross recipient for valor at Iwo Jima, went home to Antigua, Wisconsin. He ran toward the word corpsman for 36 days on that island and did not say what he had seen. That is the weight the Marine in the July 25th photograph is carrying when he raises his arm. The specific accumulated weight of what that gesture has cost on every island between Guadalcanal and Okinawa, every time someone believed it was safe to approach a man who appeared to need help. Before the psychological warfare branch changed a word, one Marine had already found the answer alone at night, without a weapon. His name was Guy Gabaldon. He was 18 years old. He was Mexican-American, raised partly by a Japanese-American family in East Los Angeles, which meant he spoke Japanese not as a studied language, but as a family language in the way you carry a language when it belongs to people you trust. In July 1944, on Saipan, he began doing something no field manual authorized and no commanding officer had approved. He walked out alone at night toward Japanese positions and spoke. He walked toward men who had been issued the same pocket-sized booklet that had made the Goettge Patrol possible, men who had been told all their lives that surrender was disgrace and that Americans would kill them if they came out. He walked toward them alone in the dark, and he made a promise that good treatment was possible, that coming out was survivable, that the word he was offering was not a trap. His first solo sortie produced 2 prisoners. His second produced 52. Over the course of the Saipan and Tinian campaigns, Gabaldon is credited with persuading more than 1,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians to emerge from caves and positions across the islands among the largest individual hauls of the Pacific War, accomplished by one Marine approaching places he was not supposed to approach with nothing except language and the credibility of a promise. He was awarded the Silver Star. In 1960, it was upgraded to the Navy Cross. The citation does not fully account for what Gabaldon had actually demonstrated, that the cycle was not sealed, that individual human beings could step outside 3 years of accumulated evidence, could walk toward the cave instead of waiting for what came out of it if someone was willing to make the approach and mean what they said. What Gabaldon did alone in the summer of 1944, the psychological warfare branch spent the autumn trying to systematize. By late 1944, Allied analysts working on Japanese prisoner psychology had identified something that Gabaldon had navigated by instinct. The barrier was not only fear of death, not only the Senjinkun, not only the criminal code threatening officers whose men surrendered. Part of the barrier was the word itself. Japanese has two common words for surrender, kosan and kofuku. Both contain the syllable ko, a descent, a movement from high to low, a becoming less. To surrender in Japanese in the language as it existed inside the military culture the Senjinkun had built was to name yourself as something diminished. The word performed the disgrace it described. Allied linguists now understood you could not ask a man to perform an act whose name was designed to destroy him. The OWI Directive of December 1944, classified at the time, stated it directly. It must be emphasized again that the word surrender, kosen or kofuku, and prisoner of war, horyo or furio, never be employed in propaganda. A Japanese prisoner later identified only as Inagaki in the records of the Far East Liaison Office told his Australian interrogators that cease resistance was survivable, where surrender was not. The word itself had been weaponized as evidence of moral failure long before anyone fired a shot. The phrase Allied PSYOP analysts settled on was built around the concept of ceasing resistance, a stopping, not a descent, not kosen or kofuku, a formulation designed to make the act survivable in language before it could be survivable in fact. Millions of leaflets carrying that phrase and the promise of good treatment Gabaldon had made with his voice 2 seasons earlier were dropped over Okinawa before and during the campaign. PSYOP analysts later noted that the surrender text was printed in large type on the leaflets, partly so that American soldiers would see the words and hold their fire. The leaflet was designed to slow both ends of the cycle simultaneously. The surrender rate climbed from approximately 1%, the baseline established across every previous Pacific island, to approximately 12% on Okinawa. The prisoner-to-dead ratio shifted from roughly 100 to 1 to 7 to 1. More than 10 times as many men came out alive. Still 88% on the wrong side of it. The cycle was not closed, and on July 25, 1945, on a hillside on Okinawa, a Marine whose name is not in the file raised his arm at a cave mouth and the Marine in the photograph on July 25, 1945, knows most of what this documentary has just told you. He knows what happened at the Matanakau River in August 1942 because the knowledge spread without orders and arrived on Okinawa long before he did. He knows that a man emerging from a cave is not automatically a man giving up. He knows the specific calculus of a Japanese soldier's options, the Senjinkun in the breast pocket, the criminal code that threatened his officers, the training that made the word surrender mean something closer to self-execution than defeat. He knows what the word corpsman became on Iwo Jima. He knows what happened to Ralph Ignatowski. He knows what it cost John Willis to stay in that shell hole 8 times before the 9th. Many Marines who landed on Okinawa in April 1945 carried some version of that knowledge through training rumor unit memory and the testimony of men who had survived earlier islands. And yet this one Marine on July 25th still chose to stand in the open with his arm raised. He cannot know what the man coming out of the cave is holding. That is the only thing he doesn't know. 3 years of islands of corpsmen with their insignia removed and their sidearms drawn of men who emerged from positions and detonated all of that he knows. The one fact that would resolve the question is the one fact he does not have. He is standing in the open anyway. In the official caption attached to that July 25th photograph, someone noted without comment that the surrender rate on Okinawa had reached approximately 11%. They did not note what the other 89% had cost. 3 men who lived through the same cycle went home and carried it differently. John Bradley opened a funeral parlor in Antigua, Wisconsin. He did not speak of Iwo Jima to his wife or his children for 50 years. He died in 1994. Eugene Sledge went home to Mobile, Alabama. He earned a doctorate in biology. He taught ornithology at the University of Montevallo. One day, he shot a dove while hunting and found he could not finish killing it. He wept over the wounded bird and gave up hunting entirely. His wife eventually asked him to write it down. He wrote, "With the old breed," and named in print things that most men who saw them never named to anyone. Frank Lowell, few 22 years old. Buckeye, Arizona, the last man out of the Goettge Patrol went home. The public record does not say what he did when he got there. No archive that anyone has searched contains a post-war account from few. He swam 4.5 miles home with his wounds told Richard Tregaskis what he had seen from the water, and then disappeared back into a small town in Arizona and left no record that anyone thought to look for. The photographer PFC Frank Rogers took the picture, and it entered the National Archives, and the two men in it became eventually a data point in an official caption about surrender rates. That is what the Marine knows. And still he stands in the open arm raised finger off the trigger, choosing to find out. There is no clean ending here. The order was never written, not the one that made the Corpsman's war possible, not the one that spread the lesson from Guadalcanal to every island after it. What moved instead was knowledge, the kind that travels through men who survived long enough to teach it and cannot be countermanded because no one in authority ever commanded it. What finally began to slow it was not an order of any kind. It was a redesigned word, millions of leaflets, one changed phrase. The cycle slowed. It did not close. 3 years to get from no prisoners as an unspoken agreement to a Marine standing in the open with his arm raised. One word changed, and the caves began to empty. 88% had already run out of room to choose anything else. The photograph on July 25, 1945, is still in the National Archives. The man with his arm raised does not have a name attached to the file. The man coming out of the cave does not have a name attached to the file. What the photograph shows is not a resolution, it is a data point. A Marine in the open arm raised finger off the trigger, choosing to find out in the last weeks of the last war, either of them will fight on an island whose caves were still full of men who had not yet decided, standing in a doorway made of limestone that the next 12 days would make irrelevant. The most human thing in this story, the most dangerous thing a Marine could do, and no one ordered it.